Are you carrying a computer chip in your pocket or purse that could allow thieves to steal your money or identity? We'll ask Curtis Arnold of bestprepaiddebitcards.com that question and more on the Dollar Stretcher interview. Hi, I'm Gary Foreman, editor of thedollarstretcher.com. Curtis Arnold is founder of cardratings.com and bestprepaiddebitcards.com. He's also the author of How You Can Profit from Credit Cards. With nearly 20 years in the field, he's been recognized as an expert by the Wall Street Journal, CNN Money, New York Times, and many other nationally recognized organizations. Curtis, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Gary. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Now, we're starting to hear more about the RFID cards. They're fairly new to the U.S., although I understand they've caught on quite a bit over in Europe. What are they and what can they do?
Yeah, it's interesting technology. It's the common name is chip and pin cards, but the more scientific quote-unquote name is EMV. There's different names you mentioned earlier. But chip and pin is what I like to use because it makes more sense to consumers, because literally it is a chip that's embedded in the card. And this technology has been around in Europe for quite a long time, Gary, several years. And it's been frustrating particularly for American tourists traveling in Europe. You know, there's been horror stories at like an automated kiosk that we use a card, we try to use an American credit card there to pay to go on a toll road or subway, and then that automated kiosk doesn't work because in America, we all are familiar with that card, you know, in the back of our cards, we've got the where we swipe it, and so that technology, which is some people call swipe and sign, that's got the magnetic strip on it that all of us are so familiar with, does not work. It works some places in Europe, so you can still use your American cards there, but a lot of places, increasingly, such as these kiosks, you can't use that old magnetic strip, which Gary, I like to say is basically kind of a dinosaur when it comes to card technology. We're really lacking, but good news is we're catching up, and there's been strides to address this issue, which we can talk about here.
Well, how quickly do you think it'll be adopted here in the U.S.?
Well, there's actually a new there's regulations that have been passed to implement this technology actually in 2015. So that's next year, and that's great news for consumers that we have the federal government saying this needs to be an issue that we need to address. And also the issuers have gotten very serious about this because of fraud. You know, identity theft, etc., is so rampant in our country, as I'm sure you talk about a lot on Stretcher.com, and we do on bestprepaiddebitcards.com. So the chip and pin, quite frankly, Gary, is a more secure way of conducting business with a card, and there's less fraud. I mean, it's plain and simple because the chip technology, but also it uses a pin, and we're all familiar here in the U.S. Pretty much with PIN numbers, and so it is a little less convenient than an old, you know, our traditional magnetic stripe cards, in that we typically don't have to enter a PIN. But if you have a debit card, as a U.S. customer, you're familiar some with the PIN, although a lot of people actually sign these days and don't, you know, bypass the PIN. So the PIN is an extra step, but obviously something we're still familiar with. So it won't be hard for consumers to get used to it, I think. It'll be a little less convenient, but that little less convenience in terms of security and protecting your own identity in this day and age, I think, is well worth you know, a few extra seconds at the checkout line.
Yeah, very much. Now, is a PIN required in all cases?
Well, from what I understand with chip and pin, the EMV technology, you do have to use a PIN number, and we need to make it a way, like with our debit cards, consumers have found a way to get around the PIN, entering it in terms of the signature. And actually, you know, a lot of the banks that issue cards encourage folks to sign instead of entering their PIN because of convenience. They know, you know, we as consumers are more likely to spend more if we don't have to enter our PIN number in some cases, But also the bigger issue is, and this is a complicated thing I don't want to get into, but behind the scenes, the card networks that are used, if you sign at the checkout line, basically the banks get a bigger cut of that merchant. Every time we use plastic, Gary, debit card, prepaid, credit card, the banks are getting a cut behind the scenes, and it's very lucrative. I mean, multi-billion-dollar industry. And that's called your, the fancy word is interchange fee or your merchant fee. The merchant actually pays that fee. Well, truth be told, we pay it, Gary, as consumers, because merchants don't typically absorb any fees. They typically pass those on to us. But anyway, so that's kind of the way that we're getting a little sidetracked. But the best I understand it, you will have to use a PIN number.
Okay, yeah, because I've heard anecdotal evidence where people were concerned about having something that was sending out a signal that could be read, for instance, at the next table when you're in a restaurant.
Right. Yeah, and that's a little different technology. I think you referred to that a little bit earlier in the conversation, and let's not confuse those two. They're both technologies. What you're talking about, Chase introduced a card a few years ago called Blink. And basically, you can wave that card at your checkout line. You see this at some convenience stores, grocery stores, and it's been adopted gradually in the last few years in the U.S. And that is a little different technology, in that again you can kind of and it actually speeds up the checkout lane, and that's the good thing about it. But RFID, I believe you called it earlier, correct?
Yeah, RFID was what I thought.
RFID, yeah. So that's what I'm talking about, that technology, and it has had some security issues. But these EMV pin and chip, similar but more secure in that you're not going to typically, it's a different technology, and you will.
I assume that the credit card issuing company, they have to let me know what the technology. I mean, obviously, if I've got the metallic swipe, it's easy to see. But if it's a chip and pin or an RFID, they have to let me know that that's the technology being used. Correct?
Yeah, and you need to also ask because, and it gets confusing, quite frankly, but because you got different names, you got acronyms, and it's kind of and some of it's similar, but so it gets complicated. You need to find out what kind of card you have in your wallet. Chances are it's an old-fashioned, it's got the swipe on the back of it, or rather the magnetic strip, and so that's the typical technology. But increasingly, more U.S. cards are offering both types of technology we've talked about, the EMV and the RFID. And so there are more and more cards as we kind of push toward that here in the United States, again, lagging Europe on this. But there are increasingly more cards just because of the push from consumer protection agencies. Quite frankly, the fraud is hurting the banks, their bottom line, in a big way. It's become so rampant. But you need to know what kind of technology. And I've never really been comfortable with that RFID. I mean, it's a cool thing to think you could just swipe and go, but I've never used it much personally, and because they've had some security issues where people, and I think they've addressed some of these, but when it came out, people could, a thief could walk by, and if you had that card with that technology in your briefcase, someone could walk by and intercept it. So that's always made me a little queasy. But the chip and pin is a proven technology in Europe that's been around for several years, and not that any technology is not totally criminal proof. I don't want to give consumers a false sense of security, but it is a proven technology, and we do know, looking at data, that it does reduce fraud, at least as of today. Of course, the criminals are always pretty resourceful, Gary, but got to stay one step ahead.
If we're one step ahead, we're doing well in this world.
Half a step ahead.
There you go. And now, speaking of this thing, a step ahead, if the viewers want to get more information, I assume they can go to cardratings.com and bestprepaiddebitcards.com for more information, right?
Yeah. Most cardratings.com is going to have the credit card. Which cards offer both these technologies. bestprepaid.debitcards.com is going to offer information on the prepaid cards, obviously, and some do offer this technology. And so that might be a solution. If your credit card doesn't offer the technology, look for another credit card. Or if you're just going to Europe once every so often, maybe once every few years on a trip, then look for a prepaid card. You can still have your credit card as a backup, but you could use that prepaid card, again, just for a specific purpose. Watch the fees on those, but that can be a great strategy. Now, if you're traveling over abroad a lot right now on a regular basis, I really would look at replacing your current card with an EMV, for example, chip and pin. But be mindful that credit cards and prepaid cards are going to charge you fees typically every time you use your card overseas. That fee varies. It's typically 3%. Capital One on the credit card side does not charge it's called a foreign currency fee. It comes under different names, but so there are a few that don't, and there are a few that have actually chip and pin technology and don't charge you a foreign currency fee. Some of the credit unions, a few of them offer this, but this technology is still somewhat limited, so there's not a lot of offerings, but there are some out there. There are some options to consider. Let me make one more point here as we kind of wrap up, and I alluded to this earlier, one step ahead. We as consumers need to take initiative to protect ourselves. We can't rely strictly on any consumer protection bureaus or the government or banks to do this. We need to be very vigilant, proactive, checking our accounts on a regular basis, just doing some common sense things. I set up alerts sometimes, if different thresholds. If I see if there's a charge on my account that exceeds X amount of dollars, I get a text or an email. So there's several other things you can do for free, but technologies are great and they can help us protect our identity and fraud. But at the end of the day, it is your identity, and you need to also take measures to do that. And so if we take that approach where we take some initiative and responsibility, and then we are pushing toward the banks and the government to help us too, then I think it becomes a win-win. And I think plastic can be, it's a great, very convenient, and there's a lot of benefits to using plastic. And those benefits are increased and the risk diminished when we approach plastic with this perspective.
That's very good advice on that. We'll have links to both cardratings.com and bestprepaiddebitcards.com on the YouTube presentation of this video, as well as on the website. Ernest, we thank you for taking your time and sharing your wisdom with our viewers today.
Hey, my pleasure, and I didn't mean to get on my soapbox and preach, but it's a great, passionate, and very timely topic. So
very, very appropriate. Thank you.